So I'm going to start this lecture with a little story. I really love going into Pete's and Starbucks. And one of the reasons outside of getting a good cup of tea or a good cup of coffee that I like going there is because I know exactly where to go. So there's a very clear sign that tells me, order drink here, and there's another sign that tells me pick up drink here. And of course, during COVID, we have additional instructions like stand on this circle. So I know exactly where to stand and how far apart to stand from somebody else. So all of that is very, very clear. Well, one day, many years ago, I also like boba tea, which I can't get at either Starbucks or Pete's. And so I went to County Square Market in Vacaville, and there was no sign, but there was a sign that said boba tea. And so I stood at what I thought was the counter. So it was a counter. There was a little cutout part where the person could hand you an order. And so I stood there, and the woman looked at me and kept helping other people, and I stood there longer, and there's no sign anywhere saying order drink here, but there also wasn't another sign saying order drink over here. There was no sign. And so I stood there for what seemed to be an awfully long time, to the point where I was thinking to myself, I am not leaving this store until I get a boba tea. And then finally, after probably like 10 minutes, felt like a half an hour, but probably about 10 minutes or so, the woman said, if you want to order something, you have to go over here. And it's like there was no sign anywhere. And so this brings up the topic of this discussion, which is the distinction between what are called low context cultures and high context culture. So Pete's and Starbucks would be example of low context cultures. I know you've already had that term in the first bunch of readings that you did. It's going to come up again. So just repetition is the key to good communication. And high context culture would be the example of County Square Market. I'll go into this in more detail. So, low context communication, and this is one of the reasons why we have so much misunderstanding between cultures, is that in low context communication, the messages are very explicit and they're all verbal, and it's all sort of like, here's everything you need to know. So, if you look at, for example, on the first day of class, when an instructor gives you the course materials, it's all laid out for you. If you look at any Canvas module, everything is spelled out. There's no mystery. It's all there. It's like many, many, many words. Okay. That would be an example of a very explicit verbal message. And also, not only are there a lot of words, but the words are also very direct. We haven't talked about direct and indirect communication. That's coming up. But it's basically saying exactly how it is and not finding a creative or less offensive way of saying something. So when we say let's put our cards on the table or just give it to me straight, that would be an example of low context communication. Low context communication is also perceived as being very repetitive. And so I've got an image of when you look in a mirror and you have a mirror on the other side and you take a photograph and the mirrors, repeat and repeat and repeat through infinity. Repetition is a key to good communication, and that is certainly a saying in low context cultures. Probably in high context cultures, it would be, why do you keep saying the same thing over and over? If they didn't get it the first time, they're not going to get it. But the idea that you need to say something over and over again. And so you'll notice that many instructors in your classes will say something not once, not twice, but maybe 3 times. And then there's a reminder. So, I've got reminders every Sunday when I send you an announcement. I also have a little agenda for the day that I hold up. This is what we're doing and this is what's coming up, just as a reminder. So the idea of saying things over and over and over again is natural for us because we are so verbal. But for another culture, that's going to be seen as, unusual behavior. Like, why do you keep telling me that? You told me once, I got it. Low context communication is also the burden is on the sender of the message. So the sender refers to the sender of the message. The burden is on them to be very clear. So that's why I have, many of you might not know what this is. This is an envelope with writing on it and a stamp, and used to take it to a mailbox, and then magically it would disappear and 3 days later show up in someone else's mailbox. Okay, so that's why I have the part circled of the return address, because this is the person obviously that is sending this letter or bill to somebody else. So the idea is, for example, in community college, in many community college classes, the burden is on the instructor to be clear. And when they aren't clear, then the student says, excuse me, I didn't understand that, or I wasn't sure what you meant by this. Okay, so the burden is always on us. Whoever is sending the message has to be very clear about that. Now, you're going to have kind of a shift when you transfer to a university, because in that instance, and I might have talked about this in class already, the burden is on the receiver. So it's not on the sender, it's on the receiver to sort of figure it out. That would be considered high context communication. But in low context communication, the burden is absolutely on the sender. And finally, it's okay to disagree. This is part of these, as you can see in the first bullet point, sort of the explicit verbal message. Explicit doesn't mean profanity or rudeness. It just means what I'm saying is exactly what I'm intending to say. I'm not trying to say it in a kind of a creative way. So it's okay to have disagreements. It's okay for people to say, well, I don't, appreciate what you just said. Or someone says, I respectfully disagree with, that statement and I feel the other way. There's absolutely nothing unusual about that activity in low context cultures. In high context cultures, it might be very kind of forbidden or embarrassing if someone, that would be a huge culture bump to disagree with somebody in a high context culture. All right, moving on to then high context communication, which is going to be almost everything that would be the opposite. The first is that there is less that is said or written. And so I know this is the second lecture where I've got a mime in here. I used a mime in another slide, which I think you should probably remember. And so what I'd like you to do, this is what's called an Easter egg. I have embedded some extra credit into this lecture. And if you send me a text through Canvas saying, why the two mimes, Janine? Why? And then tell me what other slide had a mime in it, I will give you some extra credit. All right, so the idea is that not much is said or written, but it's much more about nonverbals and facial expression. This leads me right into the next thing, which is, so if we're not saying it, where's the meaning coming from, or how do I figure out what this person's trying to tell me? The meaning is through two specific things. It's through the context, which remember that discussion. That's where the other mime shows up. In that the context refers to the environment, it refers to the situation, it refers to a person's nonverbals or facial expression. So you kind of look to that for a cue. I have a picture of a caterpillar in a Venus flytrap just because the idea of you need some situational awareness, just like a caterpillar would need to be aware that this is not a good landing place, that there's a better place. And so a good example of high context communication is perhaps when you were younger and you were with your parents out doing something and you did something that maybe mom or dad was incorrect and they gave you the look, you know, one of those. I mean, you know what the mom look is, you know what the dad look is. That's all high context. They don't even need to say anything. You just know that you did something improper, right? So that would be considered high context communication. So even though the United States tends to be more low context in orientation, we obviously also use high context communication. If you're in a certain situation and you've, told someone to not say something about a situation that you're in, and you're with a bunch of people and that person starts to sort of say something that you told them not to say and you sort of give them the look is high context. It's not low context, it's high context. It's like that look, like don't go there. Now, if you said don't go there, then you're being explicit and that would be considered low context. So nonverbal communication, which we'll get to shortly, would be high context communication. The burden then, just like that letter that was sent, the burden is now on the receiver to understand what it was that was being said. And this is where many times people from the United States get into a little bit of, trouble when they go to another country that is high context because they don't realize that it's up to them to sort of figure that situation out. And what many people do from the United States when they travel overseas is they kind of run it through their own filter, like, why aren't people being straight with me and why aren't they doing this? It's because it's just a different way of communicating. So the burden is on the receiver to sort of figure that out. So in a class, if you ever want to teach English in another country, be mindful of whether or not that country is high context or low context, because if it's a high context culture, the students aren't going to ask questions. And if you say, are there any questions? I'd be happy to answer questions. They're still not going to ask any questions because it's just not their way to ask questions for maybe a variety of reasons. They just won't. And so you've got to figure out how to pull them out if they're not understanding something, because it's hard to go against, you know, the way that the culture has been communicating. So, and then the last thing, which is also again opposite from low context communication, is disagreement is not okay, not okay. It doesn't matter how kind it is or how well-meaning it is or how loving it is, it's simply not acceptable because there's a link here between disagreement and the idea of saving face. And if you disagree with somebody, you might be losing face, they might be losing face. So the idea is we just don't disagree with each other, which is why in the last seminar reading, when you were reading the article about the different countries and like, well, why didn't that country just tell us that they didn't like it? It's because That's not their way to do that. It should have been figured out by the nonverbals. For example, when I think that reading mentioned that Japanese people many times will, you know, sort of suck in air through their teeth. Now, I had one of the directors at Cal State Northridge, where I got my bachelor's degree, was from Japan, and he would frequently do that when someone asked him a question or asked him if something could be done. And I never really quite knew why he was doing that, but now it's like, oh, that's why he kept doing that. Is because he was really uncomfortable with that whole concept. All right, so this is going to be I think the last slide here. So generally speaking, oh, actually, there's two more slides. Sorry. In low context cultures, directions are very, very overt. So, really good example in the real world is when you see these signs of stores closing, everything must go, and there's signs all over the place that say no refunds, no returns, no refunds, no returns, no refunds, no returns, and then the person goes up to the counter and says, "Can I return this?" It's like, which of the 5,000 signs did you not see here that you can't return something and everything is going, right? So this would be an example of low context communication or a low context communication or a low context culture. Another really good example is if you pay any bills online or if you download content onto your PS4 or you're playing another video game and you download stuff, you see this a lot. This is the end user licensing agreement. I always thought it was electronic user licensing agreement, but it's the EULA. I call it a EULA. I don't know if it's called a EULA, but I call it a EULA. It's this really long thing that you have to then click, I accept these terms, and it's just blah, 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 blah all the way down. This would all be considered low context communication, again, because it's very explicit, right? It's all right here for you. On the other hand, then, high context communication directions are very covert. It isn't quite spelled out. So it might be a course outline for a culture that is high context, may not have every bit of policy and assignment and what happens if you miss an assignment and what happens if we have to cancel class and what happens and what happens and what happens. It's not going to say all that. Those are just things that will be understood when we get there. I think this sign is probably a nice version of high context communication. So it says Monday through Saturday, 11-ish to 8-ish, Sunday-ish to ish. We may leave a little early if we're hungover or if there's neat things that we want to do. So the idea that this whole time frame is certainly flexible. Whereas if you were going into this store and you knew it was open from 11 to 8, and like many people do if they've never worked customer service before, they wait till the last 5 minutes and then walk into a store, and everybody's really annoyed by that. But if this store were closed, the customer would be very indignant and standing outside going, but I still have 5 minutes, where are they? So that would be a really good example of the distinction between low context and high context communication. I'll show this again on the next slide. I think it's a great kind of spectrum thing. I think the visual aid got cut off on the arrows there, but you have on the left low context cultures, which would be Germany, the Scandinavian countries, Finland being a great example. And then, the United States is right behind that. And then you've got Italy and Spain kind of in the middle. And we're not, on the high, we're not on the lowest of ends. And then on the other side, you have African languages and Chinese culture would also be, and Japan would also be on that end too, where it's much more about the situation. It's much more about nonverbals, about sort of understanding what you're supposed to do intuitively and not having someone actually spell it out for you. I'll show you this slide probably at the beginning of the next lecture. And that's it for an overview for the distinction between low context communication and high context communication. We'll talk more about this in class. Specifically, we will look at what are some of the problems we run into? What do low context cultures say about high context cultures, both positive and negative, probably negative mostly, and what do high context cultures say negatively about low context cultures? That's it for today.